There's a question so simple it sounds almost childish, but the longer you sit with it, the more unsettling it becomes. Are you the same person you were 10 years ago? Most people say yes, of course. Same name, same face, more or less, same basic story. But what if I told you that almost nothing, that made up your body 10 years ago still exists inside you today? What if the thing you call you is not a fixed object but something far stranger, something more like a river than a rock? This isn't a metaphor. This is a question philosophers have been wrestling with for over 2,000 years. And modern science has made it even harder to answer. It starts with a ship. In ancient Athens, there was a ship. Not just any ship, the ship of Theseus, the hero who sailed to Crete and returned victorious. The Athenians preserved it as a monument, a piece of living history docked in the harbor for all to see. But ships decay, wood rots, planks crack, and so, one by one, the Athenians replaced each broken piece with a new one. A new plank here, a new beam there, year after year, decade after decade, until one day every single part of the original ship had been replaced. And someone asked the question, is it still the same ship? The philosopher Plutarch recorded this problem, and it sounds like a puzzle about boats. But it was never really about boats, it was always about you. Here's where it gets uncomfortable, because you are, in a very literal sense, also a ship that has replaced its planks. Your body is not a fixed structure. It is a process, a continuous act of replacement and renewal. The cells that make up your skin right now are almost entirely different from the cells that were there a month ago. Your red blood cells are replaced roughly every 4 months. The lining of your gut renews itself in days. Now, you may have heard the popular claim that your body completely replaces every cell every 7 years. That's a simplification and partly inaccurate. Some cells, particularly many of the neurons in your cerebral cortex, persist for your entire lifetime. They have been with you since before you had memories. In that sense, your oldest thoughts and your newest experience may share the same neurons. But the majority of your body, the physical material of you, has been replaced, rebuilt, renewed. The atoms that made up your hand when you were 15 are almost certainly somewhere else now. In the air, in the earth, in someone else entirely. So the question is real. If almost nothing physical is the same, what makes you you? Maybe it's not the body, maybe it's the mind. The philosopher John Locke had a theory. He argued that personal identity is not about the body at all. It's about memory. You are the same person as your younger self because you remember being that person. Consciousness, and specifically the chain of memory connecting your past to your present, is what makes you continuous. This feels right. This feels like it might be the answer. But here's the strange part. Memory is not a recording. It is a reconstruction. Every time you remember something, you are not playing back a stored file. You are rebuilding it using fragments, context, emotions, and crucially, who you are right now. Neuroscientists describe this as memory reconsolidation. Each time you retrieve a memory, it becomes slightly vulnerable to change. The act of remembering alters the memory itself. This means your memories of the past are not purely the past. They are colored by the present. The you of 10 years ago that you remember is already filtered through everything that has happened since. So if your body has changed and your memories are reconstructions shaped by who you are now, what exactly is the stable thing you're calling you? Here is something most people have never heard, and it might be the most quietly radical idea in modern philosophy. Derek Parfit was a British philosopher who spent decades thinking about personal identity. In 1984, he published a book called Reasons and Persons, and in it, he made an argument that initially sounds alarming, but slowly becomes something else entirely. Parfit argued that personal identity, the idea of a fixed, continuous self that persists through time, might not be what actually matters. What exists instead, he said, is psychological continuity, an overlapping chain. Your memories, values, habits, desires, personality, they connect your past self to your present self not like a solid rod, but like links in a chain. Each link connects to the next, but the first link and the last link may share almost nothing. And his conclusion, the part that stops people in their tracks, was this. Personal identity, in the strict sense, may not be a coherent thing. And once he realized that, Parfit said he felt not loss, but relief. He wrote that before this realization, he had been imprisoned in himself. Afterward, his ego seemed to dissolve. The barrier between him and others felt thinner. His past and future felt less rigidly his. The loss of a fixed self felt like liberation. But maybe we were looking for the self in the wrong place from the beginning. Psychologist Dan McAdams has spent decades studying how people understand their own identities. His conclusion? Identity is not an object, it's a story. What we call the self is a narrative. an ongoing story we tell about who we are, where we came from, and where we're going. We are the authors and the protagonists simultaneously. This is why the same life event can feel completely different depending on where it falls in your story. A failure at 30 feels different depending on whether you frame it as the end of something or the beginning of something. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur called this narrative identity, the idea that the self is constituted through time by the act of telling and retelling our own story. Not a fixed thing that exists, a story that is always being written. And here is the part that most people find unexpectedly moving. If you are a story, then you are not finished. No chapter that has already been written can define the chapters that haven't been written yet. The person you were at your worst moment is a character in your story, but they are not the author. You are. There's something interesting here. This entire line of thinking, that the self is not fixed, that identity is fluid, that clinging to a permanent you creates suffering, was not invented by Western philosophers in the 20th century. It was articulated over 2,500 years ago. In Buddhist philosophy, the concept of anatta, often translated as non-self, holds that what we experience as a permanent, fixed self is a kind of useful illusion. What actually exists is a constantly changing collection of processes: perception, sensation, mental formation, consciousness. No fixed thing at the center. Buddhism does not present this as a terrifying fact to be denied. It presents it as something to be understood, because clinging to the illusion of a fixed self is, according to this view, one of the primary sources of human suffering. We suffer when we insist that the version of ourselves from 10 years ago must be preserved unchanged in the present. We suffer when change, which is the only constant, feels like a violation of who we are. The ship changes, the river flows, the self moves, and the ancient tradition says, let it. So what does this actually mean for you? Not philosophically, practically. It means that the version of you that made mistakes 5 years ago is connected to you. Yes, through memory, through consequence, through the chain Parfit described. But that person is not you in some fixed, permanent sense. You have replaced planks. You have added new ones. The chain continues. It means that when people say they're not the kind of person who does something, they may be describing not a truth, but a habit of self-narrative. The story they've chosen to tell, and stories can change. It means that the tendency to recognize that you've changed enormously in the past, but to assume you are now finally complete and finished is almost certainly wrong. The person you will be in 10 years will look back at the person you are right now with the same mixture of recognition and distance that you feel when you look at photographs of yourself at 15. And it means that grief over who you used to be, the relationships, the certainties, the version of yourself that felt more intact, is real and valid. But it is grief over something that was always moving. The you that you're mourning was also never fully fixed. Here is where I want to leave you. The ship of Theseus paradox has no clean answer. Philosophers have debated it for centuries and they have not resolved it. It is possible, they never will, because it is not the kind of question that gets answered and filed away. It is the kind of question that changes how you see yourself every time you return to it. Maybe you are not the same person you were 10 years ago. Maybe you are. Maybe those two things are both true simultaneously, depending on what you mean by same and what you mean by you. But here's what I think is more interesting than the answer: the question itself. Because the moment you stop assuming that you is a fixed, solid, finished thing, the moment you hold it a little more loosely, something shifts. The mistakes of your past become less like permanent definitions and more like earlier chapters. The uncertainty of your future becomes less like a threat and more like an open page. You are not a ship that has been preserved unchanged in a harbor. You are a ship that is still sailing. And the question was never whether the ship is the same. The question is, where is it going?